Whether or not we consider the year 2000 to be an arbitrary transit point, it has around it a cluster of prophecies.
We're just pawns in the hands of the divine who was mad at us anyway.
I do not know of a single unfulfilled prophecy that would prevent the Lord's returning today.
We don't need God for the apocalypse.
When you think about apocalypse, most people will say it's about doom, gloom, retribution.
Apocalyptic ideas are central to American culture.
All the great prophets of history, they all predicted disasters.
Endings are beginnings.
The new millennium promises hope for some. It threatens annihilation for others. Destruction and redemption, cataclysm and renewal. These end-time scenarios are wholeheartedly embraced as we count down to the year 2000. Millennial fears and expectations are as old as mankind. The idea of the apocalypse exists in the societies of all people. It is a part of religion, an aspect of culture. It is a spiritual necessity. It is profoundly human. But all things human have the potential for tragedy, and unfulfilled prophecies can exact a terrible toll.
Well, I was on a radio show on UFOs and alien abductions, and we went to phone calls, and the calls started coming in where a number of people who identified themselves as members of the Nation of Islam said that there was no debate. There are UFOs, there is a mothership in orbit around Earth, and in 1999, the mothership is going to release the smaller ships, and they are going to attack and invade American cities. How do they know this is true? The Reverend Minister Farrakhan has been to the mothership. Well, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I personally find Farrakhan to be an intelligent, rational man. Does he really believe this? Turns out he really does.
Minister Farrakhan's Mother Wheel is a heavily armed spaceship the size of a city, which will bring destruction upon white America, but save those who embrace the Nation of Islam. The idea is not unique. It is a type of prophecy that is as old as mankind, and it is not the only time Americans have embraced it.
And I immediately thought of the 1890 Ghost Dance by the Dakota Sioux, and I blurted out, the Ghost Dance, you know, the 1890 Ghost Dance. There's a common theme running throughout both this belief by African Americans that, you know, the Messiah is coming, so to speak, in the form of aliens to rescue them, and Native American mythology about the same thing. And the myth is this: destruction, redemption. This is what I call the Messiah myth, that no matter how bad things get, the Messiah is coming to rescue us. It gives hope.
In 1889, a total eclipse of the sun was dramatically visible in the sky over Nevada. A Paiute Indian named Wavoka was in its path.
Wavoka was feverish, he was sick, and so he was in his teepee hallucinating when the solar eclipse came over him, just by chance. But that kind of conjuncture of events is the sort of thing that triggers messianic movement, and it did.
By the time the eclipse was over, Wavoka had realized his prophetic mission, to bring the Ghost Dance to his people. The Ghost Dance was a dance to herald the Messiah, a dance for redemption.
The Messiah would come and the buffalo would return. The fallen warriors from all the Indian wars would return out of the ground. They would actually be resurrected and return. And with that, peace, prosperity, freedom would come to the Native Americans.
The Ghost Dance spread. tribes all over the West danced to throw off the shackles of oppression.
To bring on the Messiah, you had to dance. So it was clockwise, counterclockwise, around a fire, around a tree. Everybody had different versions as it swept throughout the western United States. It wasn't just the Dakota Sioux, it was all these different groups, and they all had slightly different versions.
Kicking Bear, the leader of the Lakota Sioux, introduced a ceremonial shirt into the dance. He believed the gods would make the shirt impenetrable to bullets during war.
So this was the component that really made white Americans living in the West nervous. Not just that the Messiah is coming, but that there would be a war and the Indians would be impervious to bullets. This sounded like talk of another revolution coming.
Tensions escalated. The U.S. government sent troops to suppress this prophetic uprising. But the Indians continued to dance.
More and more Native Americans started doing the dance. More troops came in, more dancing, and you could see a cascading of tensions on both sides.
The great Sioux chief, Sitting Bull, famous for his role at Custer's last stand, now an old man, was shot and killed in a skirmish with cavalry troops who were trying to quell the Indians' ghost dancing. This was the beginning of the end.
A couple of hundred Native Americans were surrounded by a couple of thousand American troops with cannons, with rifles and guns and so on. The event that triggered it was the soldiers went into the teepees, into the personal belongings of the Native Americans to try to find any guns to take them away. That made tensions, really high. At that moment, a medicine man started doing the ghost dance, and he took some dirt and he threw it up into the air and reminded the Native American soldiers that the vests that they wore were impervious to white men's bullets. Somebody fired a shot.
And so it was, on December 29, 1890, near a cold and desolate South Dakota creek, the 250 Sioux, men, women, and children, were massacred. The ghost dance was over.
It was the end of the ghost dance and a great tragedy.
The tragedy of Wounded Knee. This, the most infamous massacre in Native American history, resulted from the wholehearted belief in a prophecy that never came true. For some Native Americans, the sight of Wounded Knee represents the lost dreams and hopes of a better future. Prophecies, like the ghost dance, have always affected human history. Specters of destruction and redemption have existed since the dawn of time. Some of the most powerful visions of these end times come from one source, the Bible. One of the most powerful visions of the millennial myth is in the book of Revelation, the last and most disturbing book of the Bible. Revelation prophesies an apocalyptic confrontation between good and evil at the end of time. With its vision of cataclysm and renewal, its ghastly images and mysterious signs have inspired fear and hope throughout the ages. It has become the foundation for Christian millennial beliefs.
The book of the Revelation and other passages do in fact tell us that the earth will go through an unparalleled time of suffering, pain, and death. The scripture's pretty clear on the fact that probably 5/6 of the population of the earth will die during the tribulation.
In Revelations, it is a lamb that unleashes the destruction of the world. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse set out to ravage humanity. The earth quakes, the sun turns black, the moon turns bloody, and stars fall from the sky. During the time of tribulations, the rapture, the return of Christ, is a Christian's only hope for salvation.
If the Lord Jesus Christ were to come today with the sounding of the trump, the calling out of the church, which we call the rapture, the tribulation period, the 7 years of Jacob's trouble would ensue upon the earth. Somewhere early in would be the revelation of the man of sin called the Antichrist. If in fact the coming of the Lord is imminent, should the Lord come, for example, the next 10 years, it would mean that the Antichrist must be alive upon the earth today, because he will be an adult man when he appears during the tribulation.
The book of Revelations, with its apocalyptic vision of violence and vengeance, has endured because it promises that the faithful will triumph over evil. It brings a millennial message of hope against impossible odds.
Here is a text which is promising the imminent transformation any second now, telling the story so vividly that you can almost taste what it's promising. And as a result, it not only creates the desire for this, but in some senses satisfies it in its absence. It's so filled with symbols that you can read it any way you want.
Let's remember that Christianity was really a millennial movement. And it is perhaps the first dramatically failed millennial movement. After all, the Gospels clearly indicate that the early followers of Jesus expected him to return, expected the final climactic overthrow of evil and the establishment of this new world, this heaven on earth, to take place in the near future. For 2,000 years it hasn't happened. That has not in the slightest bit diminished the expectations of the human spirit.
Apocalyptic thinking is central to Christianity. It's rooted in the Jewish prophetic tradition, which turned to visions of apocalypse as Israel suffered under foreign conquerors. Jesus and his followers were just one of many rebel Jewish sects which anticipated the coming of a Messiah. The Essene, who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls, were praying for the final days when they would join the angels to fight evil rulers of the earth. Jesus, on the other hand, preached a radical morality of love and forgiveness. Turn the other cheek.
And this is characteristic of many people who are, if you will, in the upswing of apocalyptic expectation. They can be very generous. The real issue is what happens in the disappointment. How do you handle the disappointment? Because everybody's headed for disappointment who believes that the Messianic kingdom is about to dawn.
There's no question that date setters always get disappointed. Whenever we violate Scripture, in which we're warned not to set dates, we can expect to pay a price for that, and that is disappointment.
The prophecy of the second coming gave hope to the first Christians. They expected the imminent return of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. The challenge was how to keep faith alive in the face of continuing disappointment.
Now, prophecy interpreters today generally don't pick specific dates. They say the end is imminent, it's going to occur soon, but very rarely do we get people saying it's going to happen on April 1st or December 31st.
The idea took hold that the end times would come 6,000 years after God created the world.
There are many evangelicals who believe that 6,000 years ago Adam and Eve appeared on the earth, and they could be right. They could also be wrong. And then there's a verse which says that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. And so dispensationally, they determine that we have come through 6 days of history. Now, the 7-year tribulation period that follows the rapture and the 1,000-year reign of Christ makes up the 7th day.
But the early Christians remained focused on the coming of the end. When Christianity was adopted as a religion of the Roman Empire, the church leaders tried to change this end times view.
The Christian church itself, therefore, began to recast the very meaning of millennium, to say that it was, in fact, the coming of the Christian church on the earth that was the millennium.
The common people of the Dark Ages looked to the future for the arrival of the Savior, but they lived in fear of the coming doomsday. Every invading horde was taken to be the Antichrist. End times fever reached a peak with the approach of the year 1000. Farmers stopped planting crops. People abandoned or gave their property to the church and left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with no intention of returning. Signs of the end were everywhere. Famine, plagues, earthquakes, eclipses of the sun and the moon, Halley's Comet.
It was a period of rising anxiety in the latter half of the 10th century that became increasingly intense as one got closer to the year 1000. because there was apparently a widespread belief that it was going to end.
But there was a problem. The world didn't end. The millennium came and went, and the Middle Ages began. All around the world, other people and cultures also struggled with their own end times fears.
I think it's important for people to know that these ideas have existed historically. They exist cross-culturally. It's not just something that's occurring as we approach the year 2000. Almost every society has had ideas about the end of the world.
All religions have a millennial myth, and every culture has an end times vision of death and rebirth.
The pattern is of a cleansing of the earth and of the community in which you live in some way that is usually dramatic, traumatic, and relatively sudden. And this sense of a cataclysm preceding a renewal is part of almost all of the expectations of an end that we can see anywhere in the world.
Jewish prophecy has a long tradition of end times fears and hopes for the coming of a Messiah.
I think we owe the idea, the central idea of the millennium myth, to the Jewish prophets who had a sense that the future could bring something brand new. Whereas history as it was conceived by the ancient Greeks and Romans and most other cultures tended to be cyclic. Things repeat themselves. The genius of the Jewish prophets was that they saw the possibility of some new element that would enter into the course of history. And I believe that this futuristic vision is really one of the most powerful forces in human history.
The world of Islam has always had two redeemers, the Mahdi, who will come at the end of every century to renew the faith, and another more mysterious figure who heralds the end times. This is the 12th and final Imam, who went into hiding over 100 years ago, and who will emerge to cleanse the world and lead Islam to its final triumph before the millennium. While the Western view of time was linear, the Eastern view was cyclical, but their end times have always been just as horrifying. Hindus see the world as passing through 4 ages, beginning with a golden era and ending with a final age of darkness, the Kali Yuga. For the Hindus, it is still the age of darkness and will continue to get worse and worse until the goddess Kali comes forth and annihilates the world and begins a cycle again with a new golden age. But until then, Hindu prophets see only suffering, death, and a sudden, terrible cataclysm. Buddhists believe we are living in the second of 3 eras. One they call the Age of Counterfeit Doctrine. What follows is the last days of doctrine when the Buddhists believe a Redeemer, called the Maitreya, will lead the faithful to a pure land in the West. This belief and fear of being left behind inspired incredible uprisings, rebellions, and mass migrations.
The Taoist Great Mother was combined with the Buddhist younger son, the Maitreya, to become this duality of powerful redemptive figures, half male and half female. Such combinations led to secret societies, which became radical revolutionary political groups at the end of the 18th century. Just as the French Revolution was happening in the West, there were tremendous uprisings in China.
The Taiping Rebellion in the latter 19th century was fueled by a volatile blend of Chinese and Christian millennial beliefs. Leader Hung Soo-chung saw himself as a second son of God and believed he was establishing the heavenly kingdom of great peace. In 1853, Hung captured Nanking and made it his New Jerusalem. For more than 10 years, his 60 million followers held off the imperial army, but in the end, they were massacred. A similar fate befell the Aztecs in Mexico. They mistakenly believed that their prophecy of the return of the great white god Quetzalcoatl was fulfilled when the conquistadors of Spain arrived. Uncertain whether the Spanish soldiers were gods or men, Montezuma waited until it was too late. Cortez captured him in his own palace, and the Aztec Empire fell in a bloody conquest. Across the ocean, medieval Europe was seeing a resurgence of end times beliefs, along with troubled battles of its most powerful leader, the Catholic Church. Millennial movements inspired by fantasies of salvation gripped Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Seers, prophets, and new messiahs arose, accompanied by great numbers of followers. St. Francis of Assisi left the worldly life in 1205 to devote himself to the care of the sick and poor.
It was only perhaps coincidence that the followers of St. Francis might identify St. Francis himself as this new man and believe then that they were, as Franciscans, the vires spiritualis, the vital spiritual men who would lead the rest of the world into a new era, a new kingdom.
One group of Franciscan brothers predicted a holy millennium in which all men would be united in contemplation and voluntary poverty. Inevitably, they were condemned as heretics, which only increased their fury against the church. The Franciscans came to see the church as a whore of Babylon and the Pope as the Antichrist. In their spiritual millennium, they expected an angelic Pope chosen by God to convert the world. The Pope's troubles were just beginning. In 1300, the externist monk Fra Dolcino gathered an army of fanatical monks and waged ruthless war against the Pope. In the end, they were defeated and massacred. Fra Dolcino was burned at the stake, but protests against the corruption of the church continued. This turmoil raged throughout the Middle Ages. Uprisings, rebellions, wars, massacres, and protests rocked the church in Rome. Pope John XXII, besieged not only by rebellions, but by scheming monarchs as well, tried desperately to rescue the church from crisis. Under pressure, the papacy was moved to Avignon, France. This resulted in Europe being split politically and spiritually. Then, Europe disintegrated into chaos and was dealt its most devastating blow, the Black Death. This horrific outbreak of bubonic plague killed 1/3 of the population of Europe. Villages were deserted, cemeteries overflowed, and violence decimated the countryside. It was an age of Satan triumphant. It took nearly a century for the church to re-establish in Rome, but by the late 1400s, it was again dominant. The faithful returned, and the church became the wealthiest and most powerful force in medieval Europe. The Millennium halfway mark in 1500 brought an upsurge of apocalyptic fears and expectations. The Protestant Reformation, another movement against papal rule, was a response to a church corrupted beyond redemption. It was led by a fiery German religious reformer, Martin Luther.
Luther accuses the church itself, the whole church, of being the Antichrist. The whole church, that is the Church of Rome, accuses Luther of being the Antichrist. And in either case, because the Antichrist is now here on earth, the end and the second coming must be soon.
Yet, once again, the end didn't come. Luther's Reformation flourished. Apocalyptic fringe groups continued to rise and fall, while the eyes of the prophets and seers gazed toward the next millennial signpost, the distant and ominous year 2000. The year 2000 looms as a crossroads of time. By mysterious coincidence, many ancient calendar cycles come to an end soon. The greatest is tied to the sun's passage through all 12 constellations of the zodiac. As we enter the age of Aquarius, a vast cycle of time is coming to completion.
There's something called a cosmic year in astrology, and it happens roughly every 26,000 years. What also happens roughly every 26,000 years is that all the great time cycles of the ancients come to an end and give themselves rebirth. Now, all of this is happening in our generation, and that is unique.
The 500-year cycle of the Druids, the 3,000-year cycle of the ancient Persians, the 7,000-year cycle of the Jewish Kabbalistic mystics all predict the end times soon. The Mayan calendar, the most accurate ever devised, comes to an end in 2012. Perhaps it's no wonder that so many seers and prophets point to 2000 as a time of cataclysm and renewal. Prophecy is as old as man's desire to know the future. Throughout history, more than 50,000 people have claimed to be seers. Of these, the most famous is Nostradamus. John Hogue is one of today's most popular interpreters of Nostradamus.
You cannot study the history of prophecy without feeling the giant shadow cast over you by Nostradamus. He is huge, he is controversial.
Nostradamus lived over 400 years ago. He was a doctor of medicine in rural France until he set himself up as a prophet in 1547. His prophecies were written as rhymed quatrains. In his time, he became famous for predicting the death of King Henry II in a jousting match. In our time, some interpreters have looked at the prophecies of Nostradamus and have found that he predicted the fire that destroyed London in 1666, the French and American revolutions, the assassination of the Kennedys, and man walking on the moon.
We are now experiencing the 7 final plagues. The plague of blood, Nostradamus talked about, which is about immune system, AIDS and many other things that are happening with the immune system, CFS and other things, Gulf War syndrome. It is about hidden poisons of nuclear pollution. It is about the ozone holes. It is about the seas dying.
Another Nostradamus prophecy speaks of 2 brothers of the North, who were not yet brothers, as being victorious against the Easterners.
Russia and America are supposed to be brothers, says Nostradamus, the great kings of the North. They will be brothers, though, for a very short time. And their brotherhood is undermined by a North African Libyan source. Just when it looks like peace is happening to the world, that's when it all unravels. And the date window for that is from 1997 through 2011, 2012.
Hogue sees the coming conflict as being more insidious than past wars.
World War III, the Aquarian Age War, is a war of terrorism and social breakdown. It's a battle between the old versus the new.
But the most ominous of Nostradamus' prophecies concerns the rise of 3 antichrists. According to his interpreters, the first was Napoleon, the second was Hitler, and the third, and worst of all, is yet to come. A mysterious figure from the Middle East who will unleash an apocalypse that destroys much of mankind.
Nostradamus basically predicted this as a time when a great and terrible war would be prepared by the West. He describes a very apocalyptic war where neither man nor animal would survive. He talks about a war of a third Antichrist. His war lasts 27 years, and I imagine that it starts in the summer of 1999.
One interpretation of what Nostradamus said is, the Antichrist very soon annihilates the 3. 27 years his war will last. With blood-soaked human bodies, water, and red-colored icy rain covering the entire earth. When will this terrible war occur? Many interpreters of Nostradamus believe it is coming soon and cite one of his few prophecies tied to a specific date. In the year 1999 and 7 months, the great king of terror will come from the sky. Some people take a more skeptical view.
Nostradamus is probably the best regarded prophet of all time. Several reasons for that. First of all, his books have been rewritten over the years. If you buy one of these popular recent books on Nostradamus, you'll find that referring back to earlier editions is quite a surprise because it disagrees with those earlier editions. They've changed the spelling of the word, the capitalization, the punctuation. They've even taken 2 lines from one quatrain and put it with 2 lines of another in order to make it match history. This is called rewriting the prophecies after the event.
When you really look at the evidence of what the Nostradamians claim are predictions, they're really all post-dictions. That is, they can't make predictions. They only look at what he said after some current event occurs that is interesting to us.
It's one of those things where any translation, any interpretation of it, if it's accepted, can prove almost anything. There's one quatrain in Nostradamus, for example, which is said by the devotees, by the believer class. It is said to have predicted Watergate, Napoleon at Elba, the assassination of JFK, and the end of the American Civil War. 4 of those major events in history in one 4-line verse? That is quite remarkable. Another reason for Nostradamus being so popular and so lasting down through the ages is he wrote so much. He wrote literally thousands of verses. Eventually he got to get lucky. Unfortunately for him, there are only 103 examples in all of his writings where he actually mentions a time and a place, or a time and a person and a place, or any combination of those 3 events. In all 103 out of 103, he was wrong. He didn't get lucky even once. Bad luck.
The 20th century seer, whose prophecies are considered by many to be significant for the millennium, is Edgar Cayce, a simple man from Kentucky. He became known as the sleeping prophet because he gave his prophetic readings while in a trance. In his vision, he saw cataclysmic earth changes. Japan and Northern Europe suddenly disappear. The Great Lakes overflow and cover most of the Midwest. California and New York are covered with rising floodwater, and the lost continent of Atlantis rises again. John Hogue also believes in Edgar Cayce's prophecies.
Edgar Cayce's Earth changes prophecies are very intriguing because he makes remarkable statements in the mid-30s, actually in the early 30s, saying that the magnetic core of the world was going to change. And just 2 years ago, they estimated that the magnetic core did actually shift, and it shifted in 1936, the year he said it would shift. He talked about earthquakes in Morocco, which happened. He talked about Etna blowing up in 1957, 58, it happened. And because of the accuracy of his first wave of Earth changes, from then on, people were going, my God, this guy's scary, because he's saying that the Earth is going to shift on its rotationary axis sometime by 1998.
Edgar Cayce has many followers to this day. He also has many skeptics.
Well, Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, was a fantasy-prone personality with a clever imagination and a well-read, bright guy who put all those together into a package. And all it is somehow us looking for transcendence to another world. Because when you go to their library, it's unbelievable. They have just hundreds, thousands of volumes by Edgar Cayce. Each of them are big, thick volumes of all his readings. He's bound to get all kinds of things right, just by chance. You're not having a controlled experiment where you set up some criteria about what percentage have to be right for us to determine if this is something that's real or if it's an artifact of probabilities. And it's clearly, it's the latter.
Many Native American prophecies foretold the coming of white men from the east. 1,000 years ago, according to legend, the deity Masao gave the Hopi Indians of the Southwest a number of prophecies.
What they said has taken place. And these are all things that they could not possibly have known about 1,000 years ago. Even Nostradamus hasn't come close to the fulfillments that have happened with the Hopi.
Southwest historian Thomas Males sees a fulfillment of Hopi prophecies. White people did come. They did take over Hopi land and convert the people to white man's religion. They also did try to end Hopi culture, just as the prophecies foretold.
The Hopi also believe that the world will go through 4 cycles, and we are in the 4th cycle now.
The 4th cycle will end in fire. Atomic bombs, what Hopi prophecy calls gourds of ashes, will destroy most of humanity. The 5th cycle represents the dawn of a new world, but a world born out of devastation so great that we must begin all over again. The Hopis, with this vision, follow an ancient tradition of end-time belief, destruction and redemption. It was a theme shared by the new arrivals to this country, the white man. America's millennial roots are deeper than most of us realize. The discovery of America itself was a millennial accident. Columbus believed that the end of the world was coming in 1660. He saw himself as a divine instrument chosen by God to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth so that Jesus Christ would return.
So Christopher Columbus, who signed himself Cristoforo Colombo, which means the Christ-bearing dove, thought he was bearing the dove of the Lord across the oceans to the pagans of China and Japan, and he was distressed to find a continent between, because it meant now that the job of converting the world to Christianity was going to be that much harder, and it might not be doable before the end.
The New World became a magnet for millennial hopes. Americans saw themselves as a chosen people, whether they were Puritans building a heavenly paradise or the founding fathers fighting a revolution. And end times focus has existed throughout American history. It has surfaced in spiritual awakenings and social experiments. Both came together in utopian communities like the Shakers, led by Mother Ann.
She felt that Christ had returned in feminine form, and she was fulfilling the divine prophecies. She felt she was the embodiment of Christ, right? So in a way, the millennium was being established on earth through her.
Darker apocalyptic expectations also ran deep in the American soul. The greatest movement grew around a prophecy interpreter named William Miller, whose careful calculations convinced more than 50,000 followers that Jesus would return in 1844.
Jesus says, I'm coming back. And he also says, you shall know the signs of my return. And he also says, you can't predict when I'm going to come back. So he says 3 very important things. I'm coming back, you'll know the signs, but don't try to guess when. The fact that he says he's coming back has been essential to the whole history of Christianity.
But William Miller did believe he could guess precisely when Jesus Christ would return. On October 22nd, 1844, Miller and thousands of his followers gathered together to await the Savior's appearance.
And they waited, and they're all in a room or a barn somewhere, and they waited, and the clock finally ticked midnight, and they realized that they had been wrong. Hiram Edson writes in his memoirs, "A spirit of weeping came over us such as I have never experienced before. We wept and wept until the day dawned." The most remarkable part of that story is that, you would think people come together, they have a prediction, the prophecy doesn't come true, pack it up and go home. They don't do that. What they do is go on from the ashes of that disappointment. They go on to found what is today one of the largest and most rapidly growing Christian denominations in the world. That is the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Not only the Seventh-day Adventists, but the Jehovah's Witnesses arose from what was called the Great Disappointment. Both grew out of a troubled time, the American Civil War, and nothing fanned end times fever more than President Lincoln's assassination.
he was immediately seen as the Christ who had died for the sins of the country. That there was that hope for the transformation, and all there was death and suffering that followed it.
The aftermath of the Civil War saw end times views becoming the basis for American religious thought. A shift in thinking happened from post-millennial, where Jesus and the promise of redemption comes after the end times, to the more frightening pre-millennial, that through Jesus and his return, the end still comes, and only the chosen ones escape annihilation.
The post-millennialist view is a much more hopeful view for human society. You have to remain committed to a human future, and you have an obligation to relieve human suffering and to help others, and in order to try to make things better, in order to inaugurate that divine change. The premillennial view is always associated with dread and violence and the suddenness of endings, ends evil and then brings about the change and the goodness that only Jesus can lead us into that.
While fundamentalism took root in rural America, another vision gripped urban America. The rise of science and the progress brought by the industrial age seemed to promise a secular millennium. The 20th century was hailed as the century of centuries, sure to carry progress to unimaginable heights. By the year 2000, anything seemed possible. People would eat little pills that provided all the nourishment they needed. People would no longer walk on land, but fly to different levels in future cities.
In the midst of all these predictions about what would happen in the 20th century, not just the pill for food, but also greater speeds at different levels above the earth, no one ever could figure out a solution to traffic. The millennium may come, but there will still be traffic jams.
1900 is the great victory of positivist hope that reason and technology and democracy are going to transform the world into a secular millennial utopia.
But it didn't turn out that way. The 20th century became the living nightmare of end times prophecies. From World War I, the war to end all wars, to the horrors of the Nazis, from the specters of nuclear terrorism to the devastation of overpopulation and pollution, we have crossed the threshold of the apocalypse. Nearly 2,000 years have passed since the book of Revelations predicted the end of time. But we still face possible annihilation.
What you have now is this rejection of the idea that reason and technology are enough. Emotionally, we're not nearly as mature as we are technologically powerful. And that as a result, we don't know what the future holds for us. We seriously are capable of self-destruction.
Futurelessness is the great threat that we all face as a result of the scientific technological changes that have engulfed the world in the 20th century. So we could go with a bang in a millisecond if all the bombs go off, or we can go with a whimper of environmental degradation. We can go slowly, but either way, we can go.
We all would like there to be a better tomorrow. So end of the world scenarios, they're not really bad news, they're really good news. The silver lining of the clouds, so to speak. There's something good coming, but we have to go through bad first. So destruction, redemption.
We all have our hopes for the uncertain future. We all have our fears. The question is, what will happen in the year 2000?